Can an immaterial mind ever stop a physical body from acting? I hope not. I want my body to be unstoppable. We're also going to recollect the recollection argument today. Remember that thing? It's the only philosophical argument that contains an explanation of why you've heard it all already before. And finally, we'll take a look at some of Plato's forms. I hope he finished filling them out. Dr. Bauer's office hours. Let's get some study guide questions up on the board. 1. What is Simmias's objection by analogy? 2. What is Cebes's objection by analogy? 3. What is Socrates' argument from degrees against Simmias? 4. What is Socrates' argument from unequal virtue against Simmias? 5. What is Socrates' mental causation argument against Simmias? 6. What puzzling phenomenon did Socrates discover in his youth, and what does he take it to show? 7. Which two sorts of explanations does Socrates mention before his final argument? 8. What is Socrates' final argument for the immortality of the soul? Those are the study guide questions, and as always, you'll want to follow along with a pad of paper or a laptop or maybe a sweater that you're crocheting the answers into, some way of recording the information so that when it comes up in the video, you'll be sure to note it. We're doing the Phaedo, continuing along right after Socrates appears to have solved a puzzle about why you shouldn't kill yourself to get to the afterlife more quickly. And we saw Socrates give 3 arguments for why he's going on to a better place. The argument from opposites, the affinity argument, and the recollection argument. That was in the previous video. So it looks like Socrates may have something to look forward to. He's about to drink hemlock tea and be executed, and they're hoping that he's going on to a better place. At around line 86, we get 2 objections to Socrates' conception of the soul and the afterlife, which he has just so painstakingly argued for. The first is voiced by Simmias, and the second is voiced by Cebes. To raise his objection, Simmias presents the image of a well-tuned lyre, or like a well-tuned guitar. Fun fact, our word guitar comes from the ancient Greek kithara, which was a stringed instrument that was plucked with a wooden pick. Think of a guitar, or a kithara, or a lyre, or a violin, or think of any stringed instrument, and imagine that its strings are correctly in tune, so that the strings are in a kind of harmony. It's an unfortunate fact about the English word harmony that it refers both to the audible sound of the strings when they're plucked, as well as the state that the strings are in when they're correctly in tune. For the argument that Cebes presents, or for his objection rather, think of harmony as the state that the strings are in when they are properly attuned, right? The instrument has a certain harmony, and the harmony of the strings, argues Simmias, is something that is invisible. You cannot see the harmony, but it's there, and it's an important excellence of the instrument. It's a feature of the instrument that it is harmonized. You can see the strings, you can see the parts that are harmonized, but you cannot see the harmony itself. Now, Simmias asks, does this fact about the harmony, do any of these facts about the harmony show that the harmony is immortal? That it outlasts the instrument? That you could smash the guitar and the harmony of its strings, the in-tunedness of its strings would still be there? No, of course not. And so, worries Simmias, in the same way that a harmony is an invisible, excellent thing that is tied to the physical instrument, but it cannot outlast the physical instrument's destruction, why can't it be true also that the soul is this invisible, excellent thing that is tied to the body, but cannot outlast the body when the body is destroyed? In contemporary metaphysics and philosophy of mind, there's a view called Epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism about the mind specifically says that, first, the mind is an immaterial entity, it is a non-physical thing, but secondly, that it cannot outlast the body, that it is ultimately dependent on the body for its existence, and perhaps dependent on the body for its features as well. This kind of dependence, which the mind, if it's an epiphenomena, has on the body, is sometimes referred to as supervenience, which is a very fancy way of saying dependence. There are many kinds of dependence, which you can detail in various ways. There are many kinds of supervenience, which you can detail in many ways. We'll do a video on it at some point. But the point is that you could claim that the mind is immaterial while maintaining that it is mortal. You could say that the immaterial mind has some kind of strong dependence on the physical body. And that's what Simmias is raising as a possibility with his metaphor of the harmonized instrument, or the instrument and its harmony. He's saying, well, Socrates, even if we've shown that the mind is immaterial, how does that prove that the mind outlasts the body? Before Socrates responds, we also get a second objection from Cebes. Cebes, like Simmias, uses a certain kind of image for a metaphor. In his case, he talks about a man who wears out many cloaks over the course of his life. By the way, this is the second mention of cloaks in this dialogue. We mentioned it earlier when talking about the recollection argument, when we said that someone could be reminded of a person by seeing their cloak. I like to think, the literary person in me likes to think that this constant mention of cloaks is intentional, and it's kind of a metaphor, thinking of the body as a cloak for the soul. And indeed, that's the metaphor here. Cebes says, the fact that a person outlives their cloak, and the fact that they outlive many cloaks, that doesn't show that the person will live forever. It just shows that the person is longer lasting than a cloak. And even if we've shown that the soul can outlast a body, why does that show that the soul lasts forever? What if, by every successive incarnation, the soul is damaged a little bit more, and it fades away a little bit more from reality, until finally, like the faintest flicker of a flame being snuffed out into the dark, it dissipates? Why can't it be, in other words, that the soul outlasts some bodies, but does not last forever? If that were the case, that would also be a worry for Socrates, who's hoping for some kind of assurance that he's immortal. So, we have these two objections. We have the epiphenomenal perspective of Simmias, modeled on a harmony which is dependent on a physical instrument to exist, and we have the perspective of Cebes, which says that even if a soul can outlast some bodies, that by itself doesn't show it lasts forever. How can we show that it lasts forever? Socrates contends with these objections in order. Socrates directs 4 arguments against Simmias. One of them is incredibly influential, the one about mental causation. The other one's not so much, but we're going to go through them anyway. First, simplest and easiest, is the objection that, hey, Simmias, your perspective is incompatible with the recollection argument. Remember, the recollection argument, if it's sound, shows that the soul can exist before it is embodied. That prior to embodiment, it's hanging out with those immaterial, lovable entities, the forms. If that argument is sound, then it cannot be that the soul is as dependent on the body as a harmony is on the stringed instrument. For the harmony cannot predate the stringed instrument. It cannot exist before the stringed instrument does. Yet, according to the recollection argument, a soul can exist before its body. So much the worse for that perspective, concludes Socrates. And he makes this joke, how can you harmonize your objection with our previous, philosophical jokes. So next he does this argument from degrees. And this is at around line 93b to c. This argument is very, very simple. It goes like this. First, being a harmony admits of degrees. In other words, something can be more or less of a harmony. Imagine the stringed instrument and you've got it perfectly in tune. It's like its strings are in perfect harmony. And then you slightly turn one of the pegs so that now it's slightly out of tune. I mean, it's still harmonized, mostly, but it's less of a harmony. It's less harmonized. and so on if you turned it even more, and if you turn the different pegs, right? There's this idea that something can be more or less of a harmony. But can something be more or less of a soul? Socrates thinks not. He thinks that either you're a soul or you're not. Either you've got a soul or you don't. There's no such thing as like 50% soul in the way that there could be like 50% harmonized, right? That's an important difference. So the argument is basically, being a harmony admits of degrees, being a soul does not admit of degrees, so the soul cannot be a harmony of bodily parts. The easiest way to object to this argument is in that premise about being a soul doesn't admit of degrees. I could easily imagine some metaphysic according to which perfect health equals perfect insouledness, like you've got the most soul when you're healthy, and then like as you're less healthy and more injured and more diseased, you are literally less alive, and you have less of a soul. Right? I don't think there's anything incoherent about that, even though there may be many strange things about that. That's as plausible a view as any about the soul, and it's incompatible with one of Socrates' premises. Socrates' next argument, the argument from Unequal Virtue, which occurs around 93 to 94b, is much like the argument from Degrees. It's even worse of an argument, in my opinion, because it has more assumptions built into it. And so those are more places that you could attack and object and say, oh, no way, I'm not giving you that. Here's what that argument is. First, every soul is equally a soul. Second, if souls are harmonies, then every soul is equally a harmony. Third, if every soul is equally a harmony, then every soul is equally harmonized. Fourth, if every soul is equally harmonized, then every soul is equally virtuous. Let's just pause here on that premise. What is this notion about if every soul is equally harmonized, then every soul is equally virtuous? Well, there is some kind of appeal to the folk wisdom of Socrates' time, which attested that to be a virtuous person means that your soul is in some yet-to-be-specified sense in a harmony. That virtuous people have harmonious souls, or that a virtuous person has a harmonious soul. This is a bit of common sense for Socrates' time, and so is easily taken as a premise in this argument. But not every soul is equally virtuous. There are some vicious people, after all. So, not every soul is equally harmonized. So, not every soul is equally a harmony. So, souls are not harmonies. I mentioned that this argument is similar to the argument from Degrees but worse because it has more assumptions, and I meant it. First of all, you could continue to object to this idea that every soul is equally a soul. You might say that a healthy person and a sick person have souls to different degrees. That's something that has yet to be refuted. But in addition to that, we could also dispute this folksy premise about virtue being harmony in the soul. That is not something that's obviously true, and you might say that virtue is better defined another way. Indeed, Aristotle and other later Greeks might say that, really, a virtue is a feature that allows you to perform your proper function well. This definition is going to come up again later, by the way. So you could press there, too. You don't have to accept that every soul is equally a soul, and you don't have to accept that virtue is a soul's harmony. Those are two places you could easily press and therefore resist the argument's conclusion. So far, not very impressive. But the final argument against Semius has some traction and has influenced many people who want to talk about mind-body dualism. The argument goes like this, that a harmony as a purely epiphenomenal entity, as an entity that's purely dependent on and produced by and determined by the physical strings, that harmony is not something which in turn acts upon the instrument. It's an effect, it's a result, it's a dependent secondary phenomenon. It does not affect the thing that produces it and shape the thing that produces it. So, if the soul is like that to the body, if the soul is something that is produced as a result of the body being in tune, if the soul is a secondary, dependent, epiphenomenal effect of the body, if the soul is a mere non-physical result of the body's being in tune, then it cannot act upon the body and shape it and force it to do things. But, if we recall from experience in everyday life, very frequently what's going on in our soul forces our body to act or to stop acting. Consider when I accidentally touch a hot stove, immediately I am in pain. There's a mental phenomenon, a phenomenon in my soul, a mental feeling of pain. Ouch! The ouch feeling! And that feeling causes me to withdraw my hand. My hand is forcibly withdrawn because my mind, the pain, caused it to, interceded on it. There's this idea that mental states can cause your body to act. My belief that there is a drink in the fridge and my desire for a drink together cause my physical body to go over, open the fridge, and retrieve a drink. That's mental stuff causing physical stuff. That shouldn't happen, says Socrates, if indeed the soul were just a harmony. Let's formalize this argument as follows. First, a harmony of parts is affected by those parts and does not affect them. Second, if the soul is a harmony of bodily parts, then the soul is affected by bodily parts and does not affect those bodily parts. 3. But the soul does affect the body's parts. 4. So, the soul is not a harmony of bodily parts. As I said before, this argument is quite influential. If you look up the literature on mental causation, you'll find an interesting set of discussions about mind-body dualism and the problem of the mind causing the body to act. Many argue that since the mind causes the body to act, the mind cannot be immaterial, whereas others say, no, it just means the mind can't be immaterial and epiphenomenal. And there's some rich metaphysics going on right there. Now, this argument, at least in the mouth of Socrates, is vulnerable to a certain critique, namely the following. When we consider the soul acting on the body, we're considering mental stuff, beliefs and desires and pains and things like that. But is that what we agreed the soul is? No. Originally in our discussion, we agreed that the soul was the thing that causes you to grow and be alive. It's the élan vital, it's the life force, as it were. The thing that makes you be alive, right? That's what the soul is. Suddenly, as soon as we're objecting to Simmias, the soul is the seat of mental phenomenon. It is the realizer of mental phenomenon. It's where the beliefs and the desires are. And these are, at least by definition, different things. We might say, no, Socrates, we can't say that the soul is the animator and then appeal to an argument that says the soul is the thinker, right? Which is it? And if it's both, what kind of a theory allows for it to be both? That's the way that I would go about objecting to this argument anyway. Note that this objection might not apply to contemporary versions that don't accept the ancient Greek conception of the soul. So we get those arguments against Simmias. First, Simmias' objection is inconsistent with the recollection argument. Second, the argument from degrees. Third, the argument from unequal virtue. And finally, the mental causation argument, the best of which is that last one. Moving on, it seems that Cebes' objection is taken much more seriously. The whole gang sits down and has a real cry over how devastating this objection looks. All of their arguments, if they show anything, they seem to just show that the soul outlasts this body or that one, or if you're alive now, your soul must have at some point been among the forms. But none of those arguments show that the soul lasts forever. And when they consider the prospect of showing that the soul must last forever, they almost give in to despair. Socrates warns them not to give in to despair, and that you shouldn't suddenly just grow ashamed of thinking about arguments at all and grow sick of them because a few of them have mistreated you. any more than you should hate all human beings because a few of them have been mean to you. What we get next is an interesting semi-autobiographical speech from Socrates in which he distinguishes two kinds of explanation. One kind of explanation involves mentioning physical parts of things, physical aspects of things, and physical forces that move them around. The other sort of explanation has to do with mind and why things are good, or why they are supposed to be that way. As an example of the two kinds of explanations Socrates has in mind, he says, first, let's consider why I am sitting in jail. Why am I sitting in jail? One kind of explanation would say, I'm sitting in jail because my limbs are arranged that way. I'm sitting in jail as a result of my ligaments and my blood and my organs being poised just so in this location. That explains why I'm sitting in jail. But another explanation, he goes on to say, is that I am sitting in jail for certain reasons. Because I am serving out a sentence, because I have decided that it is just, because I have decided not to escape, which, by the way, he decided not to, and so on. In his example, Socrates distinguishes a physical sort of explanation, one that appeals to physical parts in saying why something is the case, and he distinguishes that from a reasoned-based explanation, or an explanation of what justifies the thing. In his Metaphysics, Aristotle notes that Plato did not fully distinguish the types of explanations that there are. He really only accepted two kinds of explanations, a physical kind and a non-physical kind. When we turn to Aristotle, we'll find that he thinks that there are two kinds of physical explanations, and there are also two kinds of non-physical explanations, or at least less physical explanations. Socrates says that when he was young, he thought that everything could be explained by talking about the physical properties of matter. Everything, right? Why the tides come in and out, why you have to build your temple this way and not that, why seeds grow, why bread nourishes, why birds fly. All of that has to do with the stuff that makes them up and how that stuff works. Maybe at the little itty-bitty level. Is it all fire? Is it all water? Is it rarefication of different kinds of earth and air? Well, whatever it is, that's the key to knowing everything. That's what Socrates thought. He was a young physicalist, thinking that physics is science supreme and that there's nothing that it cannot explain. But, he said, he came upon a problem. Math. What? Math. He starts to talk about, in this part of the dialogue, he starts to talk about a unit, such as a head, saying that somebody is taller than another person by a head, or that one horse is taller by a head than another. And he starts to wonder, well, what sort of physical object is this head anyway, than which one thing is taller than another? Matters get only worse when we just think of numbers themselves. When you add 1 and 1 to make 2, which physical object in the world is the thing that is the number 1, which you are adding to... Wait, what are you adding it to? Uh-oh. And we get a philosophical puzzle. It's kind of nestled in here, and it's not explicit in the text. But when I read this part of the Phaedo, there's a really easy philosophical puzzle that you can find if you're sort of practiced in metaphysics. Think of it this way. Here is a puzzle about math. Our first assumption is that 1 plus 1 is 2. Seems right. So far, so good. 1 plus 1 is 2. Our second assumption is that there is only one number 1. That seems right also. The same way that there's only one letter A and only one letter B. There's only one number 1. There are many different numerals. You can write down many different symbols, each of which represent the number 1. But when it comes to the sequence of integers, which constitute the natural numbers, there's only one number 1. That seems true also. And then finally, a thing and itself is just itself. Right? If I am sitting here, and I am sitting here with myself, that's not 2 people, that's 1. Why? Because there's only 1 of me. That's why. But now look, we've got an inconsistent triad. Each of these things seems to be true, but they can't all be true together. It can't be that 1 plus 1 is 2, and there's only one number 1, and that a thing in itself is just itself, right? If I am hanging out with myself, that should just be one person, me. Likewise, if 1 is with itself, that should just be one thing, 1. What is going on here? The problem, Socrates would say, or at least this character of Socrates in this dialogue, is that we're thinking of the number 1 as a physical object, as being something like a body or a horse or a jail cell or any other physical thing. The number 1 is not a physical object, however. It doesn't obey these rules about being with itself and not getting anything more. There are special operations which only apply to these numbers, operations like addition and subtraction and so forth. So Socrates, he concludes that he really didn't know what the number 1 was, or what numbers were, or why any mathematical explanation obtains. And that really to know the truth about things, you can't just study the properties of matter. You must also study a whole world of immaterial entities. That's the prologue to Socrates' Final Argument, which appeals very heavily to the forms in order to show that the soul must exist forever. Ready? Let's go. First, if a thing A always brings a form F with it, then A cannot undergo the opposite of F. We get the example of fire always brings heat with it. You can never have fire without heat. Or snow always brings cold with it, that wherever there's snow, there must be cold. This is a principle that generalizes from cases like that. Second, if a thing A cannot undergo the opposite of a form F, then either A is destroyed when F's opposite approaches, or A safely retreats when F's opposite approaches. Here, Socrates is using a kind of military metaphor, that when the opposite advances, the property either retreats or is destroyed in the conflict. So let's consider the case with the fire and the heat. Fire always brings heat with it. The opposite of heat is cold. If we bring something cold to fire, what happens to the fire? Well, either the fire is destroyed, or if it's not destroyed, it must safely be somewhere else. It's almost a conceptual truth there. It's either destroyed or it's not. Moving onward, the soul always brings life with it. Here we're thinking that the soul brings life with it in the same way that the fire always brings heat with it, right? That there's this general thing, heat, and that fire is a specific occasion of heat in a thing. Likewise, there's this general feature, life, and soul is a particular case of life in a thing. The soul always brings life with it, in the way that fire always brings heat with it. So, the soul cannot undergo the opposite of life. So, the soul is either destroyed when the opposite of life approaches, or the soul safely retreats when the opposite of life approaches. So far, these are safe applications of prior premises. The opposite of life is death. Again, let's think about what we initially agreed to. At the beginning of the dialogue, we agreed that death is the separation of the soul from the body. That death is like a relationship. It's like being divorced or something, where you're not present with the body anymore, right? Here, making it sound like death is like a monadic property, like red and blue, like life and death, right? We might want to flag that as a potential place to target. So, the soul cannot undergo death. So, the soul is either destroyed when death approaches, or the soul safely retreats when death approaches. If something is destroyed when death approaches, then that thing undergoes death. This we might wonder about too. What's going on here is that Socrates wants these two things to sound similar. Fire becoming cold, and the soul becoming dead. Right? They're supposed to be impossible in the same way, right? That for fire to become cold is for fire to undergo its opposite. So if the soul is destroyed when death approaches, then the soul undergoes death. So the soul is not destroyed when death approaches. So the soul safely retreats when death approaches. If the soul safely retreats when death approaches, then the soul is immortal. So the soul is immortal. That's the argument, and it rests on this attention to what a property is and how a property cannot become some other thing. The idea is that the soul is a little bit of life, and a little bit of life cannot become dead any more than a little bit of fire can become cold. And the difference is that if you try to make a little bit of fire become cold, that just destroys the fire. But if the little bit of life became destroyed at the result of death, that would be the same thing as it undergoing an opposite. The idea is that it's a contradiction for the soul to undergo death because the soul is itself life in a thing. Life in a thing cannot undergo death any more than fire in a thing can become cold. Again, the easiest way to resist this argument is to point out that there appears to be an equivocation on the notion of death. Right? Is death the separation of the soul from the body? Or must death also be this monadic feature that a soul could either have or lack, like being red or being blue? It seems like there's two notions of death at work in this argument. In any case, at this point, it is time for Socrates' execution, and so he drinks the hemlock tea and calmly dies, right after he requests that they sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius, god of healing, because that's the thing that you normally do when someone's getting better or recovering, and he would like his friends to think that he's getting better or recovering from being embodied. Now, interesting fact, hemlock is known to us, and was known to the Greeks, to cause horrible, ugly convulsions and incredible spasms. The idea that Socrates just takes it and dies calmly is, according to many classicists and Phaedo scholars, a sign that Socrates is something like superhuman. And in other Platonic dialogues, we read that Socrates can drink an infinite amount of wine without getting drunk, and that Socrates can stand barefoot in the snow without getting cold, and all kinds of fantastic stuff like that. It's thought that maybe right here, the fact that Socrates drinks hemlock without going into convulsions, and instead he's just like he's, turning in for a night's sleep, that shows he's sort of superhuman too. But in any case, Socrates dies, and there's this rumination on what the world is ultimately like before the dialogue comes to a close. And that's the Phaedo. That's Plato's dialogue about the soul and the prospects of immortality. Do you think that last argument was any good? How about the recollection argument? You like that one? The mental causation argument? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Goodbye!